That's again the level I'm trying to find out. Does it lead to some action in terms of paying for the ecosystem service of water? How do you treat it economically? And this brings me then to the third question and third point, and another way of looking at what's happening between the global projections, which are excellent in show of the scenario risks, and then your investment decision. A lot of us have talked now about the landscape level, and when we are a natural resource and biodiversity organization, we clearly have to look at things at landscape level. And the way I would integrate the look of water, the integration of water, energy and food is very much at the landscape level, and get the people into the picture there and see how do we manage landscapes, and that was also what Peter was talking about. How do we manage landscapes more sustainably? But even if we manage to do that, and let me refer back to what the World Bank Vice President Rachel Kite said at the opening of the forum, even if we manage to address offsets and use of natural resources at the location level, we still have to aggregate it somehow to another level. For example, to the national level, in order to find out what is actually the effect and how do we really offset the use of the natural resources that we do in a particular case. It has to go to the national level simply for accounting reasons, but also for redistribution reasons. We have to pay for these services, and we have to make sure that we pay for them, these ecosystem services, and we have to pay for them somewhere. This is an issue we've seen in the rainforest, in the RED program, which many of you know, that clearly from the start of RED, it was determined that it's not, we have to get from the individual rainforest to the national level, because otherwise a country could protect red forest one place and cut it down somewhere else and claim the money over there. So that's not allowed. If you're monitoring RED, the idea is you have to monitor it for the country as a whole before you start paying. There are a lot of problems with RED, but at least that perspective and that philosophy is correct. And how do we get companies to address the aggregate, the national level? Only by getting the governments involved and making sure that the governments set some regulation and create the level playing field that companies want also. So that was my third point of saying, how do we get from the landscape to the national while getting the companies involved in paying for the ecosystem services, which clearly these two companies are interested in finding ways of doing. And then I only have the final point, and that is to get back to the global level, where Alan started very well with the daunting prospects of where we are moving. And honestly, we know that it is because it was put nicely, right? The growth percentages for food and so on. But we are reaching planetary boundaries, and somehow we need to find out what do we do with them. And I don't know how we can address it, but we need to get the companies to take one step further. When Alan very well is putting up his slide showing that social fabric is at the center, well, it's our production and consumption patterns and model that is at the center, right? It's our way of living that is at the center relative to the resource constraints. We've got to get that into the picture and into the debate and find out how do we address that. And I don't think any of us has a solution, but if we don't dare face up to that, then it is, I'm feeling there is a little bit of a gap from these global analysis showing the increase in the demand for water and food and energy, and then the decision somewhere else. We have to address the political issue of how do we find out to live more sustainably. Oof. Sorry.
Oof. This is enough for you. Very interesting. I think we've seen both a presentation of a very serious issue, a commitment to try and say we want to do something with the issue, and I think what Paul said about do something with the issue, where and at what levels and how to do it at the right levels and connect them up, is maybe part of where the challenges. So indeed, a company can look at the big issue and say, okay, then what can we do inside the fence? And that's fine, but is that enough? And you hook it up, and you actually said from the landscape to the national, but you actually did say from the landscape to the national to the global too. And then you've all said there's a need for partnerships, including a partnership with a union that is both government and non-governmental, and it actually is a partnership of government and non. I sometimes call IUCN a non-intergovernmental organization. It's an NIGO because it's a non-UN, but it's still an intergovernmental organization. And so over to you to ask questions to the panel, to Alar, about this topic, or even offer some solutions with respect to how we might go forward. Partnerships are right, but what type of partnerships? A landscape approach, is that the way to do it? How do we do it? Connecting corporate action with government policy, and connecting government policy with maybe changing even not just the production behavior, but as Paul was indicating at the end, also consumption behavior, to try and get both production and consumption sustainable. Questions, comments? The floor is yours.
Thank you, Len Hirsch from the Smithsonian, and thank you for being here. I think it's great, and we work with all of you, so that's useful. But Alar, you started this by saying we're not going to fight. We know that there's an issue. However, there are others in the industry who don't come in with that enlightened view, and which makes it, from our perspective, pardon the pun, a bit of a shell game. There's some companies that are saying, okay, we're good citizens, but then there are others who are lowering the standards for everyone, because, to be perfectly honest, if you do it right, it costs you more money, and therefore you lose out on the market. We know that very well. So how do we, or in your circles, when you're not speaking to us, when you're speaking to your colleagues, they see the same data you see. Why aren't they here? And then, what can we do together in partnership to get the rest of them here? Because it's always Shell, it's always Rio Tinto, and there are a whole bunch that we don't see.
Thank you, Dow, for coming.
Thank you, excellent question. Let me not try and answer why the others are not here. That's kind of difficult. But I would confirm and want to acknowledge that we are a strong believer that you're only as good as the worst operator. So if the rest of industry, if this is restricted to the 9 companies I refer to, then it doesn't stand a chance at all to be successful. So part of the proposition that we are working as we speak is assuming success. In other words, assuming that the pilots that we're conducting will show a resilient approach to and new business models to. Part of the issue that we collectively will also address is how we get to scale. And that's also along the lines of the theme of the conference we debated yesterday. Scale is essential. That's what I meant by let's not go back to the drawing board and debate the numbers, because then we won't be anywhere in 5 years' time either. So scale, expanding, network, a greater coalition of the willing, and having a wider society embrace is essential, just like the buy-in from that wider society. So it's a critical question, but it's certainly one that we have at the fore of this being successful and making a difference, because believe me, all the people working it do want to make a difference. And nothing is more disenchanting and demotivating if you're working something which you know is going to be not successful anyway. Right? So we want it to be successful and we want to make a difference. So it's part and parcel of the solutions we will hope to provide. But you're absolutely right.
Could you answer my water question?
I was hoping not to for a while. I'll answer the water question. Actually, I was going to answer it if there weren't already other questions on the floor. Valuing ecosystems services is clearly important. And in some cases, or or elements of this ecosystem, valuing elements of the ecosystem is important. That's why, for a number of years, we put a price on CO2, $40 a ton. I don't know whether anyone of you has been following the price, but it's been hardly over $10 for a very long time. So we take that into account. What it triggers is innovation. It triggers other solutions than the traditional I will emit. So that's good. So valuing ecosystems and ecosystem services we acknowledge. It is not the only solution though. And I'll give you an example. In some instances, or in some categories, or in some areas, you may be better off with very rigid standards than values. Take an example in Qatar, where I showed a picture of the Qatar facility. At one point in time, it was the biggest construction site on this planet. I think there was 50,000 people working to construct that facility. We invest, I don't think we've ever communicated the official numbers, but give or take around $30 billion in that facility. If we tried to factor in the value of water for that facility, it would be dwarfed by the number again. So it was much more important in the Qatari instance to say the standard will be we shall not consume any water because there's a water scarce area, irrespective of the value thing. It's just a standard that dictated an outcome that doesn't draw upon the natural resource. And that's, in this case, a much more efficient way, because that's also, Paul, the issue you alluded to. How do you move from global to national? Well, CO2 is a global issue. Water is a local issue. So you make a trade-off in a case of the Qatari facility, which is actually, because that's the negative thing, right? Recycling and cleaning water does make that facility quite a significant greenhouse gas emitter, which we also acknowledge. And it needs more innovation to bring that down. But the trade-off there was between a global issue, greenhouse gas emission, versus a local issue of water. But I know, having looked at the numbers, we would not have had the solution we currently have from no use of water whatsoever if we tried to factor in water as a value. It was much more important to set the water up as a target we shall not consume. So there's a mixed bag on all of these instances, I'm afraid.
Anybody?
Can I just add to that?
Yeah, sure.
Comment a bit. I mean, I think this sort of local, national, global dynamic is a very interesting one. What I'd say certainly about our industry is it is intensely local. At the end of the day, everywhere we operate is very different. We can operate from places in the world which are actually excess water regions, and it's more how do we manage excess water versus areas of water scarcity. It's areas which are sort of sensitive from an ecological perspective, and other areas that aren't. And in some ways, it's making sure that locally we understand those dynamics very well, and we're reacting accordingly and managing accordingly. And I think it's from what I look on, the industry operates very much on the case studies, the building blocks of good action and good management, and locally, and that does echo up and down the chain. So there is connectivity in place. I think if you do things well locally, you manage your impacts well locally, it does reflect up and down. But how you really get that whole network operating clearly needs a variety of actors playing together very effectively.
And just for Paul, listening about how do we get other people in the room, it may be in this, to me, the water, energy, food nexus is saying it isn't to get a room full of oil companies, but it's actually to get a room full of companies from different sectors who will all be doing similar type of pilots and then learning from that. So, I mean, Danone is at the conference here too, which is a big water company, but they're over in the mangrove crowd. But there's another company that is doing things on the ground that's similar but different to what Shell is doing. And so then the question is, if experimentation and pilots are what we need sort of multi-sectoral experimentation and pilots, and somehow an ability to capture learnings and lessons and insights than necessarily trying to take one sector and drive it, get a number of sectors in this. And that's where this topic seems to be a bit interesting, as it may allow for multi-sectoral partnerships. Where's WBCSD coming in Paul, you're coming.
I'm just, again, no, I agree totally with Alan that standards are sometimes a very good way, and sometimes government-imposed standards are also a very good way to promote innovation. That's what we've seen in the welfare state in all aspects. So I fully agree with that, and it's great also for a company to have sensible standards. And now I'm saying something that I haven't discussed with IUCN's water people, so I'm probably wrong. But is it true that water is a local issue? Isn't it exactly that is the transition, that it's no longer only a local issue? If you look into the data Alan gave, then it's clearly no longer just a local issue. It's a global issue. We are reaching transboundaries, global planetary boundaries, and we are going beyond those into a situation where we are using finite natural resources beyond their capacity. So how do we get us all to react to that prospect? Well, one of the ways is that we have to find either rigid standards or a price or some other mechanism that gives us incentives to act in accordance with the fact that water is not just a local issue, it's a global issue.
Nigel.
I totally agree with that point. And remember, not so long ago, you were being asked for the first time, what's your carbon footprint? You'd say, what does that mean? And then the next day you'd go and calculate it. Well, it's not long before we can ask everyone, say, what's your water footprint? You say, how do I calculate that? And you'll be able to go online and be able to calculate that very easily. I was told very recently, as part of a project that we're doing, a water program, is how much water is taken to have a cup of coffee versus a cup of tea. So I'm now trying to be a tea drinker rather than a coffee drinker.
Okay. Comments? Anybody else? Comment, question? Yes. Just say who you are. There you go.
Good afternoon. My name is Emad Ali. I come from Egypt. I'm the chair of the Nile Basin Civil Society Discourse. So now, after you hear the Nile, you understand that I'm just trying to emphasize that water is not anymore a local issue. We cannot look at it as only, the responsibility of the stakeholders at one location or one country, but it's beyond that. It's an issue of not only the security of food and water, it is also the security of nations at some point. So the point is here, which I wanted to raise, that we as a civil society, we have been trying to build this kind of dialogue between the communities, between the populations in the Nile Basin. But unfortunately, the same thing is not happening in the same way, in the same spirit, to make this kind of diplomacy. We were able to provide the public diplomacy or the community diplomacy, but at other levels, this diplomacy is not really working, especially from the private sector. I'm not talking about one specific private sector, but I think that the private sector, plus the research centers and technology as well, technological people working in technology, they can provide also another types of, as I was just saying 2 hours ago, another type of diplomacy, because without solutions, without alternatives, you will not be able to solve a problem where peoples are not having enough water to survive now. And just imagine what will be the situation in 10 or 20 or 30 or 50 years when the population maybe will be doubled. So the role is not only to give examples from, of course, a good example from Qatar is a good example to learn from, but I think we have to see also other examples and other models that could be developed in areas where the conflict is really happening, and the future is also at risk because we don't have enough solutions and enough workable alternatives for these regions, especially the Nile where I come from. Thank you very much.
So maybe water is a key topic to get moving on the nexus, and maybe that's, as Shao has done too, and as Nigel said, starting to look at the water footprint of energy and food might be a way forward. You're coming from Egypt, I'm sorry, I have to interject on this because it's an IUCN story that actually related to Paul's comments about payments. In the early 90s, IUCN opened an office in Nairobi, and the president of the country, Moi, came to open the office, and I was there. And he went off script, talking, and he talked about how the water in the Nile River came from the mountains of Kenya. And it was because of the watershed protection in Kenya that there was water in the river, and that Egypt should pay Kenya for the water. And that, of course, the state-controlled media, then the news was on, President calls on Egypt to pay for Nile River, and so you haven't paid the Kenyans yet. Actually, it's not true, the water doesn't all come from Kenya, but, but it was, you know, he was already in the payments for ecosystem services back in the early 90s. He was switched on. So water is a commodity, and a commodity that's somewhat fixed, except for the desalinization story, which the oil industry, of course, is very involved in some parts of the world. But it's a fixed union where both the food and the energy are things we can create. But then you've got water as this sort of commodity on top of Nigel's preference of saying, let's take a landscape approach. So it's something about understanding how landscapes on the world are being managed with water as a source, and water being exported into coffee or into products or into the water that goes into energy.